Did I get everything? Thank you. I can sit here, it's fine, thanks. Thank you.
Buongiorno a tutti. Farò una breve introduzione in italiano, poi sarà tutto in inglese, evidentemente. Lui è Matthew Caruana Galizia, è ingegnere, è giornalista e oggi è giornalista non solo come professione ma per passione, per ricerca della verità. Ha vinto col suo team un premio Pulitzer per l'investigazione sui Panama Papers, ha fatto parte fino allo scorso anno dell'ICAJ, l'International Consortium of Investigative Journalism, e oggi lavora, come ci racconterà, sull'omicidio di sua madre. Sua madre era Daphne Caruana Galizia, una grande giornalista maltese che è stata uccisa il 16 ottobre del 2017. Un anno fa, io sono contento che un anno dopo siamo di nuovo qui per tenere viva questa memoria, per raccontare questa storia. Un anno fa ero qui come direttore di Repubblica a presentare un documentario che avevamo fatto e a raccontarvi il lavoro del Daphne Project, che è un consorzio di 18 testate giornalistiche di tutto il mondo che continuano questo lavoro investigativo. Daphne aveva un blog ed era una donna che non si è mai fatta intimidire dal potere. Che cosa faceva? Ce lo racconterà poi Matthew. Voglio solo dire un'ultima cosa. Quanto sia importante questo momento per questo festival, che però ha contaminato il suo programma. Ci sono tantissimi incontri sulla sfida del potere, delle dittature, al giornalismo, alla libertà di stampa, alla libertà di opinione e di parola. C'è qui in questi giorni Maria Ressa, ci sono giornalisti turchi, pakistani, ed è molto importante questo aspetto, perché se c'è qualcosa che si sta deteriorando oggi è proprio la libertà di espressione e di opinione. E Matthew ha conosciuto, si può davvero dire sulla sua pelle, che cosa significa essere persone libere anche quando le convenienze ci suggerirebbero di non esserlo. Perché per anni ha visto le lettere, le minacce, le telefonate minatorie, le scritte, i biglietti attaccati alla porta di casa e poi con l'arrivo dei telefoni, degli smartphone, gli SMS, le minacce alla madre sui social. Ha visto un'escalation di attacchi e conosce anche quali sono appunto le derive del dibattito sui social. Però io credo che sia importante ascoltare lui. Matthew, please.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. It's a real honor to speak at this festival and really in this beautiful place and to have this introduction from Mario. I thought I'd start by talking a little about the kinds of things that my mother was working on. For 30 years, she worked as a columnist at two of Malta's biggest newspapers. And it was initially that work which made her well known within the island. And by the time she was about 25 years old, she was already a household name in the country. And because she was Malta's first woman columnist and also the first person to write a column in the newspaper under her own name instead of anonymously, she really broke a lot of boundaries, and she wrote about things that people had never really written about before in Malta's very conservative society, like the influence of the Catholic Church, the hypocrisy of Malta's politicians. And this made a lot of people very angry, especially a lot of middle-aged men who took themselves too seriously. But at the beginning, she sort of took this all in her stride, and I think she enjoyed the fact that she was riling these people up. But it also meant that my brothers and I, very early on, got used to the idea that, or rather we got used to this normality of living in a situation where your mother was constantly being talked about and being attacked in the press or in parliament, in party political propaganda. But things became really intense about 2 or 3 years ago. My mother had set up a blog in 2008 to give her the liberty to speak and write freely without restrictions placed upon her by her editors. And this again was really groundbreaking for Malta. No one had ever really done it before. And no one had ever sort of created the same conversation with the readers of her blog that she did. But in 2016, after the publication of the Panama Papers, things really took a turn for the worse. Both the organization that I worked for at the time, ICIJ, which coordinated this investigation, and my mother were putting out really hard evidence of corruption at the most senior levels of government into the public domain for everyone to see. It became undeniable that there was corruption within the really serious corruption within the Prime Minister's office, within many of the ministries of government. And people began to they stopped questioning the fact that there was this corruption. We put this evidence into people's hands, and it was no longer a mystery. But what we didn't expect to happen was that there would be such a strong backlash against journalists like my mother. I was very naive at the time. I thought that, I remember texting all my friends the day we published Panama Papers and thinking, wow, this is really the first step towards justice. These people are all going to end up in prison. In the next few days, they're all going to resign, there are going to be prosecutions. But not only did none of that happen, but they went on the offensive against us. And this is something that I really found unbelievable. I remember sitting there at my desk, literally with my mouth hanging open, unable to believe that these political figures in Malta were just so brazen. And not only were they denying this evidence in the public domain, but they were attacking us, the journalists that had conducted these really rigorous, almost scientific investigations into this corruption over the course of a year, and attacking people like my mother who wrote about it, and who were publishing things that weren't, they weren't about mysteries, they were hard facts. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff set up companies in Panama along with Malta's energy minister. There was documentary evidence in the emails that their accountants sent that they expected to receive $1 million a year in what were basically bribery payments channeled from Azerbaijan via the United Arab Emirates to bank accounts held in their name in offshore banking jurisdictions. And it was undeniable that this was what they were planning to do. Not only were there no prosecutions, but they remain in power to this day. And I think that's when we realized in around 2016, 2017, that things were really dangerous for my mother. It's as though, we suddenly woke up and realized that all the institutions that we imagined were there and that were functioning effectively, like the police, the anti-money laundering intelligence unit, the prosecutor's office, the judiciary, we assumed that they were all going to do their jobs. We would put this information out there and there would be a crackdown. But what we learned was that actually they weren't doing anything at all. I mean, at the very worst, the courts, the prosecutor's office, the police, they were complicit in suppressing this evidence and actually making sure that absolutely nothing happens. They were taking part in a cover-up on behalf of the Prime Minister's office. And of course, this really frightened us, but we imagined that because Malta is a member of the European Union, there had never been a murder of a journalist in Malta, or rather there hadn't been a murder of a journalist within the European Union in my living memory. And we never imagined that someone would be placing a bomb in my mother's car. But at the same time, the moment that I heard the explosion, it really was no surprise. It was a huge shock, but I knew immediately what it was. It just felt, I mean, or rather it feels now as though it was something which was inevitable. The culmination of 30 years of attacks and dehumanization of my mother, but also, especially the last 2 years or the last year leading up to her murder, which really, I mean, took things to a whole new level. Her bank accounts were frozen as part of an investigation. I mean, while she was investigating the country's economy minister, she was unable to use her own money, even at the time of her murder. She faced 50 libel suits at the time of her death. And the attacks were near constant. I mean, her face would be on the propaganda TV station of the governing party almost every single day. It was just one attack after another. And of course, over all these years, we were resilient, but as my mother said in one of her interviews about this, 10 days before she was killed, a scar forms around the wound. It changes you as a person going through all of this. I'm grateful for the model that my mother has set for my brothers and I. As one of my brothers, Andrew, said in one of his speeches, he was never prouder of my mother than the day on which she was murdered, because it meant that none of the attacks, none of the things that the people she wrote about tried to stop her before her murder worked. They had to go for a bomb, the nuclear option, he called it. It was the only thing that they could do to stop her. And at that moment, I already felt that they had lost and we had won, because from now on, everyone can see, I mean, all of Europe can see that we are on the right side. It doesn't need any explaining. And the people who killed her are on the wrong side. Everyone is, I think, united alongside us in this fight against the really evil people who did this. Now, what I prepared for this talk isn't a kind of typical speech. It's inspired by a lot of things that I read, especially an author that I like very much, Timothy Snyder, about fighting tyranny. And I think it draws upon all of the lessons that my brothers and I have learned over the past year and a half of doing the kind of work that we're doing. We all left our jobs at the time my mother was murdered. I mean, just after her funeral, I left the ICIJ. My middle brother, Andrew, was working in the diplomatic service. Obviously, that work became impossible, and he left too. My youngest brother was an academic. He also left his job. And we spent the past year and a half doing this kind of non-stop campaigning and advocacy. So I made a list of, I think, I can't remember how many they are. I think 15 points, which I think are really important, not just for the sort of club that no one wants to join, which is made up of the increasing number of family members of journalists who've been murdered, but also journalists who find themselves in a position where they're constantly being attacked and where they're currently on the defensive, where they're facing libel suits, online harassment, physical harassment in their daily lives. And this is aimed at changing our position, and instead of keeping us on a sort of defensive stand, putting us a little more on the offensive. Now, they're not in any particular order, and there's sort of no logic in the way they're ordered. I just wrote things down as they came to me over the past few weeks. But I think the first one is the most important one, that the same playbook is being used everywhere. Yes, I come from Malta, a very tiny country that most people haven't heard of before. But the same, I always say, people like my Prime Minister and people like Viktor Orban and people like Duterte, in the same way that we go to the same conferences and go to the same workshops to learn about how to do our jobs better, it's as though they also go to workshops about how to be tyrants, about how to be autocrats, about how to demolish democracy, about how to ensure their impunity and kind of disable the mechanisms that we use to hold them to account. And this same playbook is being used in all of these places, which is why the lessons that I have learned in Malta can be shared with people in other places. And the people from other countries like Maria Aresa and the Philippines, I mean, the lessons that they are learning, I'm very grateful that she's here to share them with us, because I have a lot to learn from her too. I learned this almost immediately, because following my mother's murder, I don't know why, I started reading a lot about Anna Politkovskaya. And now, my mother and I had talked about her case often, but I obviously wasn't as familiar with it as I am now. And also about Boris Nemtsov. Now, the reason that this was so important is that it kind of helped us set our expectations for what would happen in the months following. The main lesson from that for us is that all of the people prosecuted for both Anna Politkovskaya's murder and the people who are being prosecuted for Boris Nemtsov's murder are all low-level criminals. And the story is the same as it was in Malta. 2 months following my mother's murder, a bunch of criminals really low-level criminals. When you see them, they're very stupid people who have engaged in petty crime almost their entire lives. They were arrested for the execution of my mother. Now, we think that they are the people who actually did do it. But the problem for us, much like in the murder of Anna Politkovskaya or in the murder for Boris Nemtsov, even though the government of Russia and the government of Malta framed this as sort of mission accomplished, we've arrested the people who are responsible, case closed, for us, the family of the victim, it's almost as though the police arrested the gun or arrested the bomb. It's almost meaningless. It's like finding another piece of physical evidence. But it's certainly not any kind of justice for us. It feels good that they are in prison. We feel a little bit safer. But we fought hard because of this experience that we learned by reading about Anna Politkovskaya against any portrayal by the government of Malta of this as somehow being justice, as being case closed. It sort of primed us to expect what the government was going to do, which was to release these very dramatic videos of the people being arrested, of the Prime Minister of Malta to give a very sort of a dramatic press conference where he portrayed himself as being the hero of this, a bit like the press conference that Obama gave after bin Laden was killed. And we immediately went on the offensive. At the time, people were advising us to keep a low profile and to keep quiet, to not speak out. But we did the exact opposite. And I think this really helped our case, because the government of a country is an organization with limitless resources. It's really difficult to fight against it. They can hire PR agencies, they can hire advertising companies to produce very slick-looking videos. They have a limitless budget for spending on social media. But what we have on our side is that journalists are naturally kind of skeptical people, I guess, and they don't easily swallow this kind of thing. So we started speaking to journalists all over the world and telling the story, telling them that for us this wasn't justice. And I think this helped us fight back against this propaganda by the government. They also tried very hard to make it seem as though my mother was investigating some minor story about oil trafficking from Libya, in the same way that they tried to blame the murders of Anna Politkovskaya and Boris Nemtsov on stories that they were on stories that they were preparing or work that they were preparing about low-level organized criminal or extremist groups. Whereas we all know that, like my mother's murder, they were about more important things with that reached into the highest levels of government. The second thing that we learned from these murders in other countries like Russia is about what the families did following the murders. Now, like I said, we were advised to sort of keep a low profile and not do anything in public, not speak out. But again, we did the opposite. So we saw that Anna Politkovskaya's family and Boris Nemtsov's daughter, Zhanna, had gone to the Council of Europe in the year following the murders and petitioned the parliament of the Council, which is made up by members of parliament from all over Europe, to appoint a special investigator, a rapporteur, that would have a mandate to conduct a sort of supranational investigation into the murders. And this was something that, even though you can say the council or the rapporteur has no judicial or executive power, they can't do anything against the people that they think are responsible for it. But what they can do is sort of set a ball rolling that brings a lot of new evidence out into the public domain and creates a very wide-ranging investigation that specifically looks into state complicity. I think this was really important for us to do. It came at great personal cost. We weren't able to do any other work at the time. We had to spend a week lobbying inside the parliament, speaking to members of parliament, doing a sort of kind of work that we had never done before. But I think it was one of the single most important things that we've done, engaging politicians in these kinds of supranational parliamentary bodies to create and set up this investigation. And we were successful in doing it. In fact, next Tuesday, there's a hearing in Strasbourg specifically about my mother's case. After that, the investigator who was appointed, a Dutch MP called Peter Omtzigt, will present the results of his year-long investigation into the circumstances surrounding my mother's murder. It's important for us because it also looks at the stories that she reported and helps us provide justice for those stories too, not just justice for her murder. One of the other things that we did immediately following the murder, while we were doing all of this, but we were still obviously in a state of psychological shock, we did a kind of security training that was done by people who have previously worked in the armed forces. The difference with the kind of security training that I had been given at the organization that I worked for, or that many other journalists who are probably here have been given, is that it was kind of very practical and more about things that aim at changing your behavior in your daily life rather than security training related to things like email encryption or encrypted chat and things like that. Now, this helped us because it sort of got us to rationalize the situation we were in and to think rationally about the threats that we were facing and also about what was done to my mother. It taught us to sort of, we know that my mother had been followed in the months that led up to her murder by the people who put the bomb in the car. And it taught us to look out for this kind of thing, to sort of change our behavior, to look for visual cues that could give an indication that the same thing was perhaps done to us. And what this did was, it made us, it sounds counterintuitive, but it made us less paranoid. And I think helped us keep balanced psychologically and not think that every little thing that might have happened was an immediate threat. It really helped us rationalize the situation. The fourth point is really about, I guess, the wider political situation. It's about aims by governments like Malta's to following a serious human rights abuse like the murder of my mother, further divide the society and change the political discussion to something that is completely irrelevant. Now, what the Prime Minister of Malta is trying to do is very similar to what the Interior Ministry of Italy is trying to do, which is change the discussion to something which is really mostly irrelevant to most people in their daily lives and make it about a small group of people, refugees who are trying to cross the Mediterranean and change their lives for the better. Now, this barely affects the lives of people in the country. It barely affects the lives of most Italians. It barely affects the lives of most Maltese people. And what we are trying to do is make sure that the discussion in our country, and I guess the discussion in Europe as a whole, doesn't get steered further into these discussions that go towards the political extremes. We really try to keep the discussion about things which really affect the lives of Europeans, which really affect our political system. And these are things that perhaps you haven't thought about before, or rather that they are really this serious. Things like political corruption, the fight against money laundering, the fight against organized crime. These are things that really affect our political system and really affect the lives of people. This is, I think, what the discussion in Europe should be about. So I think part of our jobs as journalists is to make sure we don't get steered to the extremes, to talk more about corruption, to investigate money laundering. And I'm really happy to see that most of the major investigations over the past few years, and especially most of the investigations that have been done by big collaborative groups like ICIJ and OCCRP, are specifically about this. It's really important that we keep doing them. And I think that the fact that we're under attack now and that people like my mother are being murdered is really a sign that the work that we're doing is more effective than it ever was before, because it is turning the political discussion back to these topics. The fifth thing, again, which is related to this, is something that my mother always told me whenever I was sort of going off at a tangent in my work, which was to keep your eyes on the ball, to try as much as possible to keep away from discussions that are a matter of political ideology and stick to things which are about the basics, which are about right and wrong, good and evil. It sounds a bit fanciful to use those words, but it really is about that. Something which Bill Browder said recently, which I really liked, is that doing this work is important because it's 1,000 times more effective to fight evil than to spend your life doing things which are simply doing good, when you think about it in that way, you realize how important this is. So discussions like the ones about whether Malta is a tax haven or whether it should be allowed to be a tax haven within the European Union, these are questions that are a matter of ideology. Whether you agree or disagree with this, I mean, it's something that's up for discussion, it's up for debate. What's not up for debate is that it's wrong to murder a journalist, corruption is wrong, impunity is wrong, money laundering is a crime. These are things that everyone agrees upon. They are not a matter of ideology. So our discussion, our political debate should be as much as possible about these things. And when, as an investigative journalist, I mean, you feel like commenting on the situation in countries like Malta, Cyprus, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, it's important to keep it about things that are really a matter of right and wrong. Almost everyone in countries like my own agrees that these things are wrong, that the criminality which is occurring in our countries are wrong. Keep it less about things that are a matter of left and right, about political ideology. We can come to those later, I always say. If you want to have a discussion about tax havens, let's have that after we've solved the problems with serious and structural corruption within my country. The sixth thing is something that's a bit more personal. I'm lucky that I have two brothers and that we're all mostly the same age. I'm 33. My middle brother is going to be 32 this year. My youngest one is going to be 31 this year. So we're sort of like friends and we get along very well. We were also very close growing up. My mother made sure to bring us up in that way. We talk to each other every day. I talk to my father, my mother's sisters every day. And we make sure that we sort of divide the work between us and make sure that we take care of each other, balance things out. When one of us can't go to a particular event or can't fulfill some obligation, then the other one steps in to do it. And the thing about doing this in a family is that it's different to asking your friends or asking your colleagues to do things like this. It's not a favor when you do it. It's almost like a duty or an obligation. You can't sort of call in that favor later on. And your brothers or your aunts or your father isn't going to hold you to account for something that they've done when you weren't able to do it. So I think it's important to say this because in my experience, journalists really tend to sort of work alone or hive themselves off. There's this like myth of the sort of journalist working alone into the night at a desk. But really, I mean, my mother had a very fulfilling family life and she was very close to her family, which I think you can see in how my brothers and I have sort of done our work over the past year and a half. I think it's really important to remind people to do this, to really keep your family close. They'll be your closest support network when you're in a situation. Hopefully that is not like the one that we're in. But maybe that comes close to it. The seventh thing is again related to this, and it's something that I guess I learned over the course of the past few years of doing these investigations, because when I had really difficult times at work, when we were under a lot of pressure, and especially when I was under a lot of pressure over the past year, I really depended on my friends and the support that I got from the sort of large group of friends from university, from Malta, from daily life, my colleagues, former colleagues. It was really important to me. The messages they sent, the emails they wrote, the letters they wrote, they were just really, really uplifting. And it really helped to keep me going. again, to do this and to build this support network, it's really important, and I learned this the hard way, because obviously you make mistakes along the way, to be nice to people, to engage them in conversation all the time, even when you don't feel like, when you're under a lot of pressure, to ask people how they are, to pay attention to them, pay attention to their mood, help them when they need help, to kind of step in when they're unable to do something, take responsibility for your colleagues, again, take an interest in their lives. This is just so important. And it really, I think, helped my brothers and I build this kind of support network. And it just, again, it really keeps me going. I wouldn't be able to do it, and no one in my family would have been able to do it without this. Again, now going away completely from this, the eighth thing is something that's a little sort of, it crosses the borders of what's normally acceptable, I think, for a journalist to do, which is to work with politicians or work with political organizations to do what my brothers and I call is setting fires which have to be put out. So we do things that attempt to force an internal discussion within our country's government or within political organizations like the European Union, but especially within the government that's targeting you. So we put a lot of effort into appealing for help from political bodies that are normally considered useless, like the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is completely ineffective at taking action. That's a given. But because it's a political body that's generally well respected among governments and diplomats, and a political body which all of the governments of the world, or most of them, have subscribed to, they are forced to respect. So when my brothers and I appealed to help from the Human Rights Council to create a discussion about Malta, then the government of Malta is forced to respond as part of its obligations to the Council. I mean, its treaty obligations. And in order to respond, there has to be a discussion among diplomats. There has to be a discussion among government officials. There has to be a discussion between those officials and the head of government, the Prime Minister. The fact that they have to have this discussion is irritating to them, but it also, remember that a government is made up of people that sometimes are like you and me. I mean, yes, there are people that an Italian author, I can't remember, Nando della Chiesa, had called the 3 C's: people who are complicit, people who are stupid, and people who are cowards. They're not 3 C's in English, but they are in Italian. But there are also people who are trying to do the right thing. And when you create these discussions, these internal discussions within this government, you force these people to question what they're doing. I mean, the kind of low-level diplomats or low-level government advisors, they start to think, wait, am I really going to write a statement on behalf of my Prime Minister that attacks these people, that attacks these journalists, that attacks these human rights advocates? And maybe they think twice about what they're doing, and they start to subvert the government from within, or they resign from their job, and this creates problems. It also helps to sort of put in writing and put into written record what the position of the government is. And it can then held to be account. It can be held to these principles. The 9th thing, which would be, it would be impossible to do all of this in the 8th point if it weren't for the help of international organizations like CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, a European organization called ECPMF, Index on Censorship, Article 19, PEN International. There are just so many to mention. They've really, really helped us in our struggle, and my brothers and I have become sort of embedded, I think, within the campaigns that these organizations are conducting. We work hand in hand with them on advocacy. Again, this is not something that journalists normally do. I had never had any kind of communication with any of these organizations before my mother was under serious threat in 2017, which is when I had my first conversation with RSF. Ever since then, they've helped us work with these or navigate these political bodies that are very new to us, like the Human Rights Council, like the Council of Europe, but which are not new to them. And a lot of them have lawyers working for them who advise us and have been really helpful for doing things that would have never occurred to us otherwise. Things like litigating to start a public inquiry in Malta that will inquire into the circumstances surrounding my mother's murder and investigate whether there was a failure of the state to prevent my mother's murder or whether there was state complicity in her murder. This is something which this week we have said to the government, or rather our lawyers have said to the government, we will be starting litigation in order to initiate, because the government has refused to start a public inquiry. So I really encourage journalists who think they are under threat or are facing daily harassment to work with these NGOs. The tent is to remember that I had to sort of say this a lot early on to politicians because they had a very poor understanding of the situation in Malta, that the crisis we're facing both in my country and elsewhere in Europe, mostly on the sort of periphery of Europe in countries like Cyprus, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary. It's not a matter of freedom of expression. It's not a terrorist attack. It's not a question of intolerance. My mother and Jan Kuciak weren't murdered because people couldn't tolerate their views. Yes, there were many people in the country who could not tolerate them. And my mother would get threatening letters or from people who are mentally unbalanced and messages which were aimed to sort of intimidate her, or she would get harassed in the street. But it was really, it's really a matter of the rule of law. This is what we have to keep reminding politicians, that it's a crisis of the rule of law in Europe that's making the situation more dangerous for us. And again, I think that this is because we have become better and more effective. The tools at our disposal are better than they ever have been before as investigative journalists. And we're working in ways in which we've never worked before as part of global collaborations. But also governments themselves have become more effective at attacking us. They've learned new techniques. They also have new tools at their disposal. They've worked out ways to game social media in order to direct mobs that are directed to attack us. So it's again important to remind people that this is what it's about, that this is what the battle is about, or rather the war is about, because it really feels like that. About governments that are abusing human rights in order to weaken the rule of law. And they're doing this because they want to engage in corruption. They need to weaken police forces in their countries. They need to weaken the judiciary. They need to weaken the media because they need to ensure impunity for the bribe payments which they're laundering, for the payments from countries which are attempting to corrupt the political systems in Europe. In Malta, it's about this too. It's not entirely about freedom of expression. It is, to a great degree, but it's mostly about a collapse in the rule of law, and it's mostly about state capture, in the same way that it is in Hungary, for instance. The 11th thing following on from this is that when a major investigation like the Panama Papers happens and there are no repercussions for it, no one is held to account, then unfortunately it's up to us and up to activists to continue being the investigators of last resort and continue holding these people to account. Now, again, when the situation becomes even more threatening for us, then it's up to us, unfortunately, to, as my family did, perhaps step away from journalism or step away from the typical work of journalists and do things that journalists do not normally do, and use these same institutions which my brothers and I have used, or rather these same mechanisms of ensuring justice that are normally used by, say, activists, or normally used by people working in the fight against impunity. We did this by, for example, advocating within the European Parliament, advocating within the Council of Europe, advocating within the United Nations. Journalists do not normally do these things, but I think the reality is that we have to start doing them because we really have no other choice. Yes, it's important for us to continue doing our investigations, and we should try as much as possible to ensure that what we do does not take us away from that important work. But I think we have to put in overtime to do all this other stuff that we're not used to doing. The 12th point is that when you are a victim, then you really have to ensure that you build a trail of what I call malfeasance and misfeasance on behalf of government officials. So when you have communications with the police, or when something happens, it's important that the communications are written. If, for example, the police call you up after you make a complaint, then it's important that you insist that they communicate with you, not over the phone, but in written form. That when you communicate with them, you write letters, and they respond with letters, to make sure that everything is documented. This is really important when it comes to a later stage, when you, in our case, have to start litigation in your country's constitutional court to argue that the state has not fulfilled its obligations. When it comes to this stage, it's really important that you show that there has been this malfeasance and misfeasance, that the state has not fulfilled its obligations. You have to be able to show it. It's also good to use international mechanisms to do this. Now again, we always say, the United Nations, it's useless, but it has rapporteurs which really care about what's happening. People like the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings, a woman named Agnes Kalamard. She wrote to the Maltese government the day after my mother's murder, requesting an explanation from the Maltese authorities. And Malta wrote back to her, stating what it is doing in the investigation. And this written communication contradicted a lot of the things that the government said publicly. It's important that these rapporteurs, when they don't pay attention to your situation, you encourage them to do so that they can request these explanations from your government. Your governments are obliged to respond to these letters. The same with the OSCE. Countries that are members of the OSCE are obliged to respond to communications from its rapporteurs. So when my mother's bank accounts were frozen at the beginning of 2017, the OSCE's rapporteur for freedom of expression, Dunja Mijatovic, requested an explanation from the Maltese government, and the response of the government was that she shouldn't be defending my mother because my mother is just a hate blogger and no one should be defending her. She deserves to have her bank accounts frozen. Of course, this sort of showed what the government's attitude towards the protection of my mother was. And then it comes as no surprise that she was allowed to be murdered with impunity. The 13th point is to be as litigious as possible. Now, like I said, the government has almost limitless resources to fight you. So we need to, in this sort of David and Goliath type fight, we really need to look for efficient legal ways to fight back against the government. Like I said, we're starting litigation for a public inquiry to start in Malta. We're very lucky that thanks to the help from press freedom NGOs, we were able to obtain support of the support of lawyers in the United Kingdom who are helping us with this litigation. And our lawyers in Malta have also been very supportive and have done a lot of pro bono work for us. When you find that your lawyers are perhaps not as effective as this, that they're not helping you in the way that they should be helping you, switch lawyers as quickly as possible. Don't be afraid to do this. I mean, when you go to your regular hairdresser and they give you a really bad haircut, you change hairdresser straight away. You never go back to them. You should do the same thing with your lawyer. This is something that my mother always did. If your lawyer isn't fighting hard enough for you, then change straight away. In this way, we've been able to find really effective lawyers that are really fighting hard for us. I'm really happy that we're working with them. It's important to keep up this litigation because something my mother said was that powerful people do not respect any kind of weakness. You have to have, I mean, it helps to begin with if you have this kind of fighter's personality, if you're the kind of person who stands up to bullies. But if you don't, you have to develop it. It's something that I think you're born with, but to an extent you can also learn. And that you become litigious. You can become this kind of person who fights back against abuse. And never show any sign that you're relenting or giving up. That's so important. The 14th point is, this is the one before the last, is to be aware of campaigns that are designed to do what I call discreditation in advance. Now, when you publish article after article that's damaging to people in power, what they typically do is attack you after every single article. So they would either file a libel suit or they would release a statement attacking you or attacking your work. And it's the same sort of back and forth. But what the really kind of cunning ones do is that, and this is why I think that they've all gone to the same workshop, because they all do this, is that they try to discredit you in advance. Instead of falling into this back and forth pattern, they do something that's a really big attack on your credibility, that creates semi-permanent damage to your reputation. And the aim of this is that when you publish your next report, they don't have to attack it because you've already been discredited. No one is going to believe your work, or a minority of people is going to trust your work. So you have to be really wary of this. And of course, not do anything stupid. Journalists are in an unfortunate position where we have to be like politicians or like members of the royal family and be really careful with how we conduct ourselves in our public lives to make sure that nothing we do would allow the people that we're writing about to discredit us. It's obviously unfortunate that it's like this, but it's just something that we have to live with. I think it comes with the territory. So again, don't do things which could be used to discredit you, which is the most difficult advice to follow, probably. But also be wary that any people that you're writing about might be preparing this kind of attack against you. It's very common for wealthy or powerful people to hire the services of firms that do what's called reverse due diligence. Their job is to do the same work that we would do as investigative journalists, but instead of publishing it, they provide it or sell it to the people who would be the subject of your investigations in order to prepare them for your own investigations. The 15th thing, which is the last one, is again something that I never did before, but it's something that I really liked the way Maria Aresa put it in her talk yesterday, which is that her organization, Rappler, engages with activists, but also creates sort of communities of support and communities which engage citizens, creating new activists for justice and against corruption and impunity, and also sort of creating a relationship with the communities in which we write as journalists or we investigate. This is really important because these activists will be a support network when you need them, and they'll come out in your defense and help you. But also, we cannot do our work within a vacuum. As any kind of journalist, you depend on this kind of ecosystem of political commentators, of activists, of politicians, to create a discussion around your work, to ensure that there are repercussions for it, that there's some kind of civic response. It's stupid to say that investigative journalism is more important than activism, or that activism is more important, or it's better to be a politician than a journalist, or that being a journalist is a stepping stone to becoming a politician. No, none of that is true. We're all part of the same mosaic, or part of the same ecosystem, and we depend on each other. There is no kind of journalism that's more important than another kind. Investigative journalism is just as important as the kind of opinion writing done by political commentators. We depend on people like that to create a discussion about our work. And we also depend on activists to put up billboards that draw attention to corruption or fight back against attacks by the state. So I'd really like to thank, if there are any in the room, the activists who are working to support journalists or working to, in very difficult circumstances, fight back against the same things which we're fighting. Thank you for your work. And that's the end of all of this. I think I've managed to summarize almost everything we've done. It's the first time I did this, so it's a little strange. But I think it really summarizes everything we've learned over the past year and a half. And all of these are things which I never even thought about, let alone knew before all of this happened, which I think is why it's important to tell you, because it would serve you, I think, and perhaps help you if you're in a difficult situation, and perhaps help towards the same, the objective that my brothers and I have. We can't bring my mother back to life, but what we can do is make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. That we change the culture in our country, that we change the culture in Europe, that we create constitutional change within Europe, create structural change within the European Union to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
It's okay.
Really. We have 10 minutes. If you can stay, we have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Just the space for a couple of questions from here and a couple of questions from the audience.
We're really over time, I'm sorry.
Yeah, don't worry.
But it's Saturday, so I hope you have no appointments.
My first question is this. What does it mean to investigate on the death of your mother? Because, you know, I wrote a book about the assassination of my father. And so I know how difficult it is to deal with this kind of grief. And I would like to understand also, how do you separate the personal from the public in your work?
Those are really difficult questions. So, I mean, we grew up in a situation where my mother was always in the public domain. I mean, she was always being discussed. Her articles were always being discussed. My friends and I talked about her work. I would overhear people in the street talking about her. So I sort of got used to this over the years, and it became normal. But of course, it's really difficult to have a kind of separation, I guess, between, especially because my mother was a very private person. She hated talking about herself. She was actually very shy in person. People would be surprised by this. My brothers and I are sort of similar. So, I mean, it's been very difficult to begin to start talking about what it was like for us growing up and to talk about what my mother endured. The Daphne project, which was, I think, alongside the political advocacy, again, one of the single most important things that we participated in. This was the project done by a group of international journalists who got together, I mean, really out of a kind of personal interest and out of personal drive, because they felt really committed, not because anyone told them to do this, to continue my mother's investigations and find out why people wanted to kill her, or why the people who murdered her wanted to do so. Talking about her as part of that project was extremely difficult. It really was, I mean, because we had to relive a lot of the things that happened to us as we were growing up, like when our house was set on fire twice, once when I was 9 years old and another time when I was 20. Some of our dogs were killed. I mean, the kind of, Malta doesn't have the same culture of organized crime that southern Italy has. It doesn't have the same kind of family networks. Organized crime is done in a different way. It's people in government and people in business. It's a different kind of system, but they use the same methods. There's the same culture of omerta, and they use the same signals, like setting fire to the door of your house, which is a very sort of Sicilian thing. talking about these things was very, very difficult because we had to relive it. And also relive the fact that there never was any kind of justice for any kind of these attacks. But it was really important to do so because we thought that something my mother said in the interview, which she did a couple of days before her murder, was that the whole aim of the party political propaganda in Malta was to turn her into a national scapegoat, but also to turn her into what she called a negative role model. At the beginning of her career, she used to get a lot of messages, especially from women, letters at the time, because it was in the early 90s, telling her, wow, you're a real inspiration. I'm a woman, working in Malta's very misogynistic environment, and I really look up to you. I really admire the fact that you speak publicly, and you talk about the issues that I face as a woman in my working life. So she really was an inspiration to many people, especially to women. But over the next 2-3 decades, what happened was that the message became to the public: if you do this, if you break the mold like her, if you step out of line, this is what we will do to you. So it was a way of discouraging people from doing the same kind of thing, from speaking out. And it had an incredibly powerful effect on people. They were just really afraid to speak out because of this. So what we wanted to do was turn her back into a positive role model. And we figured we could do that most effectively by telling her story.
You worked and studied everywhere in London, in England, and in Sweden, and in Amsterdam, and now you moved back to Malta. How can you live in Malta after the death of your mom?
I can only live there because I can leave often. Otherwise it would be impossible because it's a highly toxic environment. And I think it's something that journalists who are working in, again, I keep mentioning the same countries because it's just so similar: Hungary, Romania, Poland, Cyprus, even in Italy, it's just this environment where you're constantly being attacked, where you're reminded every day of the impunity in the country and the corruption in the country. It's very, very difficult to work in this environment. It's toxic, it wears you down, which is why you have to sort of create a kind of bubble to protect yourself, I guess, or like to cope with the situation. A bubble of normality, let's say, positive normality.
Yeah. Thank you. Now I think it's time for a question from the audience.
Okay.
First of all, I want to tell you that you can sign a petition in English and in Italian, an Amnesty International petition to the Prime Minister of Malta, Joseph Muscat, asking to establish an independent and effective public inquiry into the killing of Daphne. Please raise your hands. There is a microphone, I think. Where is there?
The Prime Minister recently has talked about this, but do you honestly believe that if the Maltese police have enough evidence to charge the mastermind of your mother's murder, do you honestly believe that they will not prosecute him, they will not take him to court? And another small question, do you plan to follow your mother's footsteps in doing journalistic work in Malta and maybe starting your own blog in Malta? Thank you.
The question on prosecution is that it will be difficult for difficult for there not to be a prosecution of the masterminds if evidence is brought up that that really that is really highly incriminating and difficult to deny. The question is whether it will get to that point. There is no other authority that is capable or authorized to conduct a judicial investigation in Malta besides the Maltese police. Europol doesn't have any kind of judicial authority. It can't do its own investigations. There's no kind of international body that can do any kind of investigation. Any magistrate in Malta depends on the police to do any kind of criminal inquest. So it's entirely up to the police. The problem is that Malta's judicial system is extremely weak by design. And it's kept weak. I mean, it's deliberately not just weakened further, but kept in this state. Now, again, the question is, will the police seek to bring up this evidence that identifies who the masterminds are? What we've seen over and over again, not just with my mother's investigation, but with any kind of police investigation into corruption, into organized crime, into money laundering, always does the minimum amount of work. So the investigations are started, fine, but they are designed to collapse and designed to be ineffective. In the same way that the investigations into the murders of Anna Politkovskaya and Boris Nemtsov are designed from the start by Putin's government to be ineffective. The prosecution is designed to collapse. So on paper, it looks as though there is a prosecution. It looks as though there is an investigation. But in reality, nothing has happened. If you look at the investigation in Malta, I mean, it's the investigation of a murder in Europe with a car bomb in broad daylight after she was reporting on corruption at the highest levels of government. And you have one and maybe two, sort of one full-time and one part-time, or maybe two part-time detectives who are working on the case. It's impossible for them to fully investigate a crime of this magnitude with so few resources. And the thing is, these are homicide detectives. If you look at the resources which the Maltese government has for investigating money laundering, for investigating what's called economic crime, they're hopeless. The Economic Crimes Unit of Malta's police is one of the most corrupt bodies in our country. It's run by a policeman who is extremely corrupt, who is one of the three C's, someone who is cowardly and also complicit. And the thing is, an investigation into my mother's murder that depends on people like that, who are not even prosecuting the people she wrote about, is always going to be ineffective. And there is never going to be a serious prosecution without changes to Malta's system and without prosecutions of the people she wrote about, really.
Okay.
On the second question about whether I will write myself, that's something which I have thought about, but it's impossible. I mean, my work now is justice for my mother's stories and justice for her case. We also encourage and support the journalists who continue her investigations, but we focus on the work that only we can do.
Thank you. We have time, I'm sorry, only for one more question. No. Yeah.
Sorry, my answers are really long.
Her hands before, yeah.
Hi, I'm Michaela Topigno, and I'm a journalist student. In fact, we study at MCAST, which is literally a few meters away from where something so indecent has happened. My question to you is that I personally feel very discouraged for what I am studying. The reason being is because if we really believe that local mediums aren't ways where we can communicate, then I wondered if there's a tip where I can get people to believe me if they didn't believe in stuff that there was evidence to back it up. Sorry.
What do you mean? If you're a journalist and you're publishing something that people from the get-go don't believe, or?
Yes.
I mean, this is really difficult to answer. a part of our work is also cultural change in Malta, because we understand that this is a huge problem. Maybe I should explain about the situation in the country, which is that it's a bit unusual. The media landscape in the country is almost entirely dominated by TV stations, radio stations, and newspapers, which are owned and operated by the country's two big political parties, the one in government and the one in opposition. And the thing is, because most of the media that people consume as a result of this is propaganda that is constantly discrediting the work of journalists, people automatically discredit or rather do not trust our work. It's extremely difficult. How do you fight back against such a big machine? So what we are trying to do, or rather what we're doing, is instead of fighting for every single journalistic piece to be believed, is look at why people do not trust this work in a kind of structural way, why they are structurally predisposed to not trusting our work. And we think a big part of it is this: state-sponsored propaganda or political party-sponsored propaganda. So we want to negotiate a kind of mutual disarmament where the political parties agree to abandon their media, where any kind of media which is run as propaganda is abandoned. And we think that this will have a big effect and change the way people, it will obviously change the kind of journalism people consume, but it will also make our work more effective, I think, because right now the reality is that people trust propaganda more than they trust our own work as independent journalists.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Okay. Thank you so much to everybody, and thank you to you. Grazie a tutti.
Thank you. Thank you.